California is the world's fifth largest economy. The San Pedro Bay ports represent the ninth largest harbor complex in the world. Our ports are the engine driving the economy forward, but a powerful engine is only as strong as its components. The Harbor Association of Industry and Commerce is the collective and impactful voice supporting the harbor business community for the last 40 years. Our goal is to propel this robust community forward into the future of industrial and commercial trade. Collectively, we strive to advance our members' business through cost-effective and responsible solutions, efficient standards, and advocate for robust industry legislation. Visit harborassn.com to learn more.
Hello, and welcome to this special episode of Trade Talks. This year, Trade Talks is embarking on a tour of California's diverse and economically vital maritime and inland waterway ports. This series is a co-production with the Harbor Association of Industry and Commerce with generous financial support from SoCalGas. The HAIC was established in 1975 to be a collective voice and advocate for the harbor business community on issues related to trade, transportation, energy, and environment and land use issues. The HAIC is also committed to workforce development, ensuring that the harbor community and the many businesses which serve it have a steady stream of talent. And here at CSULB, we are grateful for their continuous support. Today's focus is the Port of Hueneme, and my guest is Port Director and CEO, Kristin Decas. At a time when the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach have been in the spotlight because of global trade disruptions, it's good to be reminded that California's other ports contribute to the state's position as the nation's leading trade gateway. Please join me as we turn our attention just a little bit north of the San Pedro Bay to Ventura County on this edition of Trade Talks. I'm Tom O'Brien with the Center for International Trade and Transportation at California State University, Long Beach. And this is Trade Talks. Welcome to a special discussion sponsored by the Harbor Association of Industry and Commerce with support from SoCalGas. My guest today is the Port of Hueneme's Director and CEO, Kristin Decas. Since beginning her tenure with the Port of Hueneme in February 2012, the port has grown 33% in cargo volume and now ranks as the fourth largest container port in California and among the largest auto ports in the nation. Over $75 million in infrastructure improvements are underway under Kristin's watch, including the installation of shoreside power for refrigerated cargo ships and handling equipment, as well as a harbor deepening project that renourishes local beaches. Kristin has also led the Committed to Community program, food drive events which leverage port customers, small business owners, volunteers, and local health clinics to bring over 1.1 million pounds of produce and other resources to 40,000 families in Ventura County. Through Kristin's leadership, the Port of Hueneme initiated its environmental framework, which has led to the development of world-class air quality monitoring to South Oxnard. Another milestone, the port was the first to receive Green Marine certification in California and earned the title of the greenest port in the United States at the Green Shipping Summit in 2017. Kristin has also served as the president of the California Association of Port Authorities, representing California's 11 deepwater ports, and was the first woman to run both the Port of New Bedford and the Port of Hueneme. In 2015, she was elected to the chair position at the American Association of Port Authorities, the fourth woman to hold the port in the association's 107-year history. Kristin, welcome to Trade Talks, and thank you. That's a lot. You've been busy.
Well, thank you for having me this morning. It's great to be here, and I appreciate the service of the university and HAIC to our industry.
Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about how this background prepares you to lead a major California port like Hueneme. What actually does the port director do?
Well, we wear many hats, port directors. One day you're out fighting for business development opportunities, you're negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts. Another day you're up against regulations in the pipeline and you have to influence policy. You're also just ground zero working and running a port, making sure that operations are running smoothly, efficiently. And then there's HR, administration, finance. There's a lot to it.
And I think people tend to think that the ports of LA and Long Beach are sort of the model for port operations, but there's a lot of complexity to what you do at the Port of Hueneme. Can you talk a little bit about what makes Hueneme unique, and maybe even share with our audience where Hueneme is? I think that's probably a good place to start.
Sure. Hueneme is about an hour north of the San Pedro ports. I would say it's the only deep water port between LA and San Francisco area, just to give some perspective of where we sit. We are geographically, strategically located, being in the backyard of LA and Long Beach, because we're in that large metropolitan basin.
And in terms of what you focus on as your business, right? I mentioned Autoports in the introduction. What does that mean in terms of your operations? What types of cargo are you moving?
Sure. So in terms of the automotive segment of our portfolio, we are the 6th largest auto port in the country. We move 10 different brands through the system into 13 states in the country. We're also very heavy on refrigerated cargo coming through the port. There's a joke going around that if you line up all the bananas that come through the Port of Hueneme, nose to nose, it's enough to go around the globe 13 and a half times. But in all seriousness, it's about 5 billion bananas a year servicing the same 13 states here. And it's a very important commodity. It's actually the #1 grocery item in the world is the banana.
Wow.
We move a lot of other commodities as well. We bring in fertilizer product and what's called high and heavy or project cargo. Turbines, yachts, those sorts of things come through the port. And one fun example is we had a shipment of a yacht for the CEO of Google, and he brought it in and then he sailed off in it. So all kinds of unique cargoes come through the port.
But you also do containerized cargo as well, right? We don't want to forget about that.
Of course, and that's how the bananas come in containers. Actually, 10 years ago, all of our fruit products and commodities came in the belly of a ship or the hull of the ship in pallets, and then they would get offloaded and then they would be forklifted into warehouses, called on-dock storage warehouses. Well, the market has changed since then. In 10 short years, all of our commodities now come in containers, and so we are fully containerized when it comes to our refrigerated cargo.
For someone who's only got a glimpse of port operations through a major container port, what's different about the way you operate, both in terms of what would the land side look like, and what does the management structure look like that makes Hueneme different?
Sure. Well, there's, I guess, where to start. Maybe we'll start at the top, right? We're governed by a body of 5 elected harbor commissioners, and so we're a little different than the other ports in the state of California, where they are what's called state lands ports from the State Lands Commission, and then those ports complexes are entrusted to the communities to run them. So they're overseen by mayors who appoint harbor commissioners. In our case, because, long story, if we go back to the beginning of our history, but we were built with private money, so we were not a state lands commission. But we were made public in 1937 by the state legislature, and they designated us as a special district of the state of California, and we're governed by a body of 5 elected harbor commissioners. And our geopolitical boundary includes the city of Oxnard, the city of Port Hueneme, and the commissioners need to be elected at large from those boundaries. So it's a different setup. We're run by an elected body.
And I think you've referred to the structure as sort of an agility leadership model that's in place at the port. Is that right?
Well, it's streamlined governance in that you don't have to juggle different priorities. Mayors have heavy lifts. They have to run schools, fire departments, police departments. The Port of Hueneme's leadership is really vested solely in the success of the port to create economic and social good for their constituents by having access to the world stage for trade.
And is there any difference in the way you interact with the clients of the port, the ocean carriers, than maybe a more traditional containerized port operation would?
Well, I think you use this expression, once you've seen a port, you've seen a port.
Right.
So we're a little bit different than the other ports in California, who primarily are what called landlord ports, where they lease terminal space to operators to run those terminals and those facilities. In our case, we actually go into direct contracts with the ocean carriers and the shippers to bring the goods in through the port, But we're not quite fully an operating port because we also give license agreements to stevedores. Those are the ones that hire gangs and labor, and they maintain the equipment to offload the cargo. So we have a little bit more control over the cargo flow through the port by having those direct relationships with the customers.
I think many would be surprised to hear that you have an elected board, because that is unique within California. How does that change the relationship that you have with the cities that are part of your network there?
So we're not like a department of the city. We're actually more of an autonomous local government agency that runs the business of the port, and the commissioners have to have a strong relationship with their constituents. So we have a strong focus on community, on sustainability, on environment, as do the other ports, but ours is just more focused on the constituents that the commissioners serve, because they need to get re-elected by those same constituents. But we have a very steady hand at the port. Our commissioners in place right now are the same commissioners that hired me 10 years ago, with the exception of one who replaced a commissioner that passed away at 92 after serving the community for many, many years as mayor and then harbor commissioner.
I know some people refer to Hueneme and other smaller ports up and down the coast of California as niche ports, and I wonder what that term means to you. Is it accurate? Is it fair? Or is it a term that we should sort of set aside for Hueneme or the other ports?
I would say it's a fair term. I mean, we have a nice ecosystem of ports here in the state of California, and we really all have our focus commodities and cargoes, and there's enough cargo right now, especially during the supply chain crunch, for all of us to succeed in our different niches. And so the Port of Hueneme's niche is the automotive trade, the project cargo, and the refrigerated cargo, automobiles.
Can you talk a little bit more about what we would refer to as ro-ro operations, right? The automotive work that you do, because it really is critical to moving product to these shores. And I think people may not have an appreciation for what role the port plays in making sure that they get the product that they're looking for.
So cars move on what's called a roll-on, roll-off ship. The buzz term is ro-ro ships. And really what they are is just large warehouses moving across the oceans. They have about 14 decks. They can hold as many as 8,000 cars. And the decks can actually shift on the ro-ro ships so that you can stow different types of cargo in there, whether it be a huge tractor. You might want to raise the ceiling. If you have all cars, you may set up the configuration of the vessel differently. But they're just moving large pieces of equipment and automotive cargo through ports on these ro-ro ships, and we move approximately 340,000 automobiles through the port on an annual basis.
It's a lot. And that gives you extended reach to Asia. So in that sense, maybe niche port isn't exactly accurate. If it's just a smaller scale than actually what's underway.
Yeah, so the refrigerated cargo services are what we traditionally call liner services, meaning they move in one port to another port, back and forth, more origin to destination, whereas ro-ro vessels tend to move around the world, and they're less regular services. So we know when our banana ships are going to come in. Our big customers, Del Monte, Chiquita, and Sealand, have regular timed berthing allotments, whereas the ro-ro ships, we kind of get a monthly schedule, and we have to forecast when they're going to come on based on where they're going around the world to get their cargo.
I think we're getting a sense of how complex the job of the director is at a place like this. You also have a unique neighbor within the context of California ports, and that's the Navy, the military. Can you talk a little bit about that relationship as well?
Sure. Shortly after our inception in 1937, we faced challenges in 1942 and World War II. So Big Navy came in and took the port over by eminent domain for several years. And then since that time, we've slowly gotten pieces of real estate back into the port complex. And now we have a shared harbor with Navy base Ventura County. And it actually is a very strategic relationship in that we have joint use agreements with them. And so we're able to use their infrastructure if it's not being deployed for a military mission, which is often the case just because of the size of our turning basin. You're not going to house a massive Navy fleet there. So the real estate is often available to the port. And what we do in lieu of paying rent, we pay in infrastructure improvements on the base, so the money stays local at the base instead of going back to Washington and into the general fund. We also have a customer, Glovis, who leases about 90 acres of property. They actually manufacture Hyundais and Kias. and are in our auto trade. And with that same real estate model, they pay in infrastructure improvements at the installation instead of paying rent. And so over about the last 10 years, about $66 million has gone into the Navy for infrastructure improvements, which really is a great public-private win and a great relationship. And particularly during the supply chain crisis, they've really stepped up, allowing us to stage cargo over there and really increase throughput and help put a dent in some of the congestion and supply chain disruptions that we've been experiencing.
Yeah, that's really fascinating and very unique. It makes me wonder, who are your key competitors? Who else does what you do, if anyone, when you're thinking about your competitiveness as a port in the state?
Well, sure, ports are very competitive, and you always have to have efficiency, productivity, you have to compete from a cost perspective, and you also have to have an environmental portfolio, because that's really important to business today, to stand out and pop as environmental leaders. Ports we compete with, I would say more in California, we share the same types of commodities. San Diego and Hueneme are very similar in terms of handling automobiles and refrigerated cargo. Some of the competitive forces that we as a state of California really need to monitor are those from the Gulf and the East Coast, and making sure they don't grab our market share here in state of California. I would say California is more united to protect our interests, working against and trying to compete with some of the other states, east and in the Gulf.
And I know staying competitive means modernizing continually and looking at what's important. Can you talk a little bit about some of the modernization programs you have underway at Hueneme?
Sure. So as I mentioned, the different business model in the break bulk commodities, when we brought everything in pallets and in forklifts, makes a very different complexion of a port facility. So we've really had to gear up to be able to handle all of these containers, which involves acquiring cranes, which we didn't have previously. So now we have 5 electric cranes from our stevedores, own and operate those. They're hybrid electric cranes. And you also have to stage cargo differently. So our warehouses on dock have become obsolete. So we're in the process of having to demolish those facilities so we can gear the port up better for handling the containerized cargo.
And you're also looking at some new partnerships, including ones with FedEx. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that as well.
Sure, I think I'll back up just a second and kind of explain how Port Hueneme works. So we have about 120 acre footprint on dock. So how do you handle $11.4 billion worth of cargo on a 120 acre footprint? So what we actually have is outside the port complex is a handful of private terminals that are owned and operated by the shipper or the ocean carrier. So once the cargo, for instance, whether it's a car or container, lands on the port, it's pretty much virtually going to leave our facility and go out to these private terminals. And so the cargo moves very swiftly through our facility, and we don't get congestion and bottlenecking. And it's a great business model in terms of our overall productivity and efficiency, and allows us to be very mobile and take on more cargo as long as we have the supporting infrastructure off port. And so part of our modernizing efforts are to look at how we can build up that capacity. And when you talked about FedEx and the new customer that we have in building a bridge for containerized freight for the first time in our history from Asia to Port of Hueneme during the challenges of the supply chain disruption, we have the ability to say to FedEx, well, you can come through our facility, but you need to make sure you have a chassis, a trucker, and a yard, and we can take on your cargo. And they were able to do that and help build and offset some of the congestion that you're seeing in the supply chain by building that bridge for us. But if they weren't able to have every piece of the supply chain in check, we could reject that cargo, which is a challenge for other landlord ports because they don't control the terminal per se. So it's going to be the terminal operator that will likely take on as much cargo as possible so that they make a buck.
And when you reference landlord ports, you're talking about that traditional model that people would be familiar with in a place like Los Angeles or Long Beach.
Sure.
Good. Well, this appears to be a good time, I think, to take a break.
Okay,
We've just started getting into, I think, the unique aspects of Hueneme and some of your plans moving forward. And when we come back from a very short break, we'll be continuing that discussion with Kristin Decas. We'll also talk about some of the unique challenges facing Hueneme, as well as the supply chain in general, and what it means for California trade moving forward. This is Trade Talks. I'm Tom O'Brien.
Dad?
Being a dad can be transformative.
but also a lot of fun. Help prepare your little monster for the outside world. Encourage their interests. Support their growth. Walk them through new relationships.
He's perfect.
Whatever you say.
And prepare them to stand on their own 2 feet.
So much of the good in my life is because of you.
Never stop being a dad.
Welcome back to Trade Talks. I'm Tom O'Brien with the Center for International Trade and Transportation at California State University, Long Beach. And my guest today is Kristin Decas, the Director and CEO of the Port of Hueneme. And this Trade Talk series is sponsored by the Harbor Association of Industry and Commerce and SoCalGas. Kristin, welcome back.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Before the break, we were talking about some of the modernization and infrastructure improvements you were making. You're also looking to do some work outside of the gates. If you want to talk a little bit about work you're doing to connect the port operations with the network that gets the goods out of the ports.
Yes, sure. So part of what we're finding is of this pandemic, if you will, in the supply chain or supply chain disruption, is that you're seeing a lot of operators in ocean, or shippers, really the shippers, right, the retailers, wanting to get more control of the supply chain. So that's put a lot of pressure on the system and building resiliency. And so we're seeing a tick up in demand, wanting to call on ports like the Port of Hueneme because we offer different types of solutions for them. And what that means is that we need to invest inside the gate and outside the gate, as you just mentioned. And so we're looking at how we can continue to build off our business model and have more inland ports to support the growth that we can realize and tap into inside the gate. And so we're looking to build a logistics park. We're working with some property owners. There's 22 different owners, so it's a touchy negotiation, but there's some real estate outside the port that we're looking to develop to support our continued portfolios and look at growth opportunities.
And I think the port's also looking at expanding something perhaps as basic as parking availability, but how critical is that to what you do?
So it's really important, and cars are a very high margin commodity for us. We may handle more in volume in bananas, but by revenue, the cars are a very important business segment for the Port of Hueneme. And as we want to grow containers, again, that's sort of that different business model. We need more staging area. We need to be able to stack containers, and we need space. But we'd also like to stack cars. But you can't stack cars unless you have something called a parking structure. So we're looking to build a parking structure inside our gate, and with all of the attention on the supply chain and these opportunities that are in the pipeline for infrastructure funding through the federal government as well as the governor's budget, we're trying to tap some of that opportunity and that funding opportunity to build up our port both inside the gate and outside the gate.
So is it fair to say that the pandemic has maybe been good for business? I mean, with the image we have is some really turbulent supply chains, but it sounds like you're moving forward and in a way that is a response to a renewed profile and higher profile because of your opportunity and ability to fill gaps.
Yeah, I guess my first reaction to that is that no one wanted COVID, right? A pandemic was a nightmare, and it put a lot of pressure on the whole supply chain system. And so I don't think it's necessarily, well, it is COVID, but it's the impact of what the consumer patterns have been as a result of COVID. And that e-commerce being up, I think at some point as high as 40% up, which just sent surges of cargo through our San Pedro partners. And to their credit, they have done a tremendous job optimizing their facilities to handle all that throughput. And a port at the scale of Port Hueneme couldn't put a large dent in a problem of that size and magnitude, but we certainly can help. And you're finding if all these niche ports line up and they take off some of the loads from the larger ports, we can make some difference for certain types of commodities coming through our complexes. So traditionally, we handled all fruit. Well, now through this new FedEx business, we're bringing in commodities we've never seen before: electronics, apparel, medical supplies, all sorts of dry cargoes that we've never handled before. So it's been a really interesting time for us to be able to build this new bridge. And I feel like that cargo is going to be sticky, as I was sort of saying earlier, because these shippers do want a little bit more control of their goods. The way I refer to Hueneme is that we're more like a taxi service or a limousine service as opposed to being a bus. And so you pay a lot less to get on the bus, but not so much anymore,
right,
because of the pandemic. So people are starting to rethink how they move goods. There's more of a premium on origin to destination and speed to market, as opposed to just cost being the primary factor of what's driving cargo. So you are seeing some shippers, Home Depots of the world, the Walmarts, TJ Maxx's, wanting to get more control and even consider chartering their own vessels on smaller ships to come to ports like Hueneme and San Diego, some of the Pacific Northwest ports, to have more fluidity when you see times of congestion like we've seen here at historic highs in congestion.
So you've seen growth in both imports and exports then?
Yes, we have, and there's some reasons behind that, but since July alone of this fiscal year, so if you run numbers from July of FY22 through February, we've seen our revenue is up 28%, our containers are up 200% on export side and 123% on the import side. And then we're seeing some crazy things in the high and heavy world and on the row ships. Our high and heavy cargo is up 143%. And to give some perspective to that, traditionally, we might move 40 pieces of high and heavy equipment. This week, we move 500 pieces. And some of the things that are coming on these ships traditionally would go in containers, and then they would go through the San Pedro ports. So now we're watching our longshoremen run off vessels and forklifts and things that would traditionally go in containers. So it's just mind-boggling when I go out on the docks and I see all these different types of small pieces of equipment that are actually getting driven off ro-ro ships that would typically handle these big containers and, not containers, tractors and equipment and those sorts of things. So it's been really interesting. On the other side, kind of flipping over to the auto side of the house, it's been seriously impacted. Our auto business is down 19%, primarily because of the semiconductor chip and the problems in manufacturing, both due to COVID and crunches in the supply chain and the increased demand for this chip. It's in everything. It's in a car, it's in a refrigerator, it's in our phone, our laptops that we've been relying on during the pandemic. And so it's really hit the automotive segment quite hard. But because we're doing so well in the high and heavy and container side of the house, our revenue is actually up 28% year to date. So it's just a new phenomenon. It's a different paradigm shift in cargo movement at the Port of Hueneme.
And I know this requires you to work differently with new customers, but what does it require in terms of coordination with the other ports along the coast? Has it changed your relationship with the San Pedro Bay or Oakland?
Well, we have the California Association of Port Authorities, and that's where the ports come together, and we really collaborate around common issues. And there's a lot of common issues that we rally around, particularly now we're fighting for infrastructure funding. Particularly important to all the ports to increase their capacity to be solutions to the supply chain. So we really come in with a united front through CAPA on various types of issues. Another one would be around regulatory issues and trying to influence policy that we have rational policies governing our port complexes.
The changes you've talked about, the new ways of doing business, are they likely to stay? Is the pandemic resulted in really systemic changes moving forward?
That's a great question, and there's a lot of unknowns. I think we have to put our crystal balls out, right? So there's kind of, the way I look at it, there's three big factors right now. Will consumer trends shift? Are we going to go back to a more service-oriented society as we come out of COVID? But are we coming out of COVID? You see lockdowns now in Shanghai again, and ports closing, and how does that impact the supply chain? We're hopeful that we won't have to go through the era of mask wearing again and COVID and all get stuck in our homes and have to buy stuff. So in talking to some of the big ocean carriers, they suggest that e-commerce really needs to shift to stabilize the surge in cargo. Then we have a different inflationary environment right now, and what's going to happen there? Are we going to go into a recession? Is Fed going to raise the interest rates, and how is that going to impact consumer demands in the supply chain overall? And then there's war. That's another big question mark. What does that all mean? That semiconductor chip, a lot of the raw materials that go into them are in Ukraine and Russia. They also manufacture something called a harness, and the simple way of putting that, that's a cable that goes in the car, and you have 3.1 miles of this cable in the average vehicle. That's all manufactured in Ukraine. So it's now having an impact on the European market for automobiles, for certain big retail, BMW and those sorts of auto manufacturers in Europe. So there's a lot of question marks on what's going to happen to the supply chain. And I'm not going to be bold enough to try and put a prediction on there, because I never would have told you a year ago that, or 2 years ago, back in 2020, we would see the influx of cargo that we're seeing today. In fact, we really tightened our seatbelts at the very onset of the pandemic. They closed all the retail for automobiles, right? And so we had 32,000 cars en route to our complex with nowhere to go. And then once we figured out that piece of the riddle, all of a sudden, all 10 of our OEMs, because of super spreads and manufacturing, stopped making cars altogether. And so we had Ro-Ro ships coming in with nothing, blank sailings. And so who would have thought a year later we're seeing these surges in our commodities? So it's a really uncertain time, but we're gearing up and hope that the trend at our port continues and we continue to see growth and opportunity, because it does create a lot of jobs.
Yeah. And the supply chain does not like uncertainty and unpredictability.
That's for sure.
One of the areas that I think has been a challenge within California, if you talk to the people who move goods, is the regulatory environment, particularly as an industry is trying to respond to these many changes you just mentioned. Can you talk a little bit about whether you see an inherent conflict in the state's mandates for zero-emission vehicles and cargo handling equipment, for example, and the ability to meet changing consumer demand?
Sure, I'll speak to that. I think we all share the goals. My board of harbor commissioners just adopted a bold goal of decarbonization, and we want to meet that with rigor. But we're not going to put a timeline or a date on when we're going to achieve that goal, because it really does have to be a rational conversation, and you need to have the technology available. You have to have enough grid power to service an all EV world if you're going to go in the direction, or you need hydrogen fueling stations if we're going to go into a hydrogen economy. So the question I feel that we should be having with policymakers is, how do we get in a room together, roll up our sleeves, and figure out how we're going to do this and what's the appropriate timeline, instead of just forcing regulations that put California-only laws in place that make us less competitive and apt to lose some market share. So I'm optimistic that we have the opportunity, especially with all this infrastructure funding out there, to have rational conversations, to move the dime and be able to move towards a carbon-free economy. The ports are all in. We want to do it. It's just we have to do it working together. By way of example, with these new Ro-Ro regulations are coming into place, and we're going to have to plug in our Ro-Ro vessels while they're at berth, which is great, and we want to do it. And we're
plugging into shoreside power.
So plug into the shoreside power. It's a $25 million project. That's a lot of money for the Port of Hueneme, but we'll find that. The bigger piece of the puzzle is our utility company doesn't have enough power to service that system. And so there's a $60 million upgrade needed at that utility plant. So we need to work with our partners and our policy influencers and our policy makers to ensure that we have enough power to be able to meet the mandate. Because you're asking a lot of the ports, you're asking a lot of the locomotives, you're asking for drayage, you're asking for trucks. So let's go, let's do this, but we need to have the power to service the industry. And the money, you need the money.
So it sounds like maybe you're suggesting not only a need for the right policy, but the right forums in which to discuss these across industry segments as well as with regulatory agencies to make sure that they're getting good information about what's happening on the ground.
Right, it's blue skies thinking. All of us want to move in that direction and achieve decarbonization or electrification, zero emissions. It's great for our communities, it's great for our own health and public health, but we just need to have the funding and the infrastructure in place to be able to achieve these ambitious goals.
One of the criticisms I've heard in the past is that the U.S. really hasn't had a national freight policy, and some of our competitors do. And I'm wondering if you see the new interest and attention coming from Washington, because of the supply chain crisis being a good thing or a bad thing? Is there such a thing as too much scrutiny, or if it comes with dollars, maybe not?
For sure, it's interesting. You asked that question. So I have served on these associations and leadership positions, and this is the first time we've gotten the attention that we feel the port systems really merit. Overall, in California alone, ports create 3 million jobs and are a very important part of the economy. And we've somewhat in national policy and state policy been a little bit of a stepchild, and there's some rationale to that. Leaders don't see freight move, right? So it's not necessarily the sexiest thing to get behind. But all of a sudden, when there's a supply chain problem and you can't get goods under a Christmas tree, all of a sudden there's a new visit to or a new thinking about how important the supply chain is. And now it's our opportunity as a port system, a goods movement system, to really get out there in front of these opportunities and talk the talk and help build buy-in of how important the supply chain is and how we need to support it at the national level, the state level, and the local level.
And what role do you see industry itself playing in sort of stepping up and saying, okay, there are things that we can do better or differently as a partner to government?
Sure, I think we could do a better job at talking with one another. I was just on a testimony in Congress around decarbonization in ports and economies, and we had shippers on the panel that are talking about running their ships on certain types of biofuels, and the ports haven't been privy to that conversation, so how are they going to fuel up at ports, right? So we've traditionally operated in silos in the good movement industry, and we could do a better job, I think, of building bridges, collaborating, and really working together to best inform policymaker as to what direction the industry should be going.
Has the pandemic accelerated that level of cooperation simply because everybody's been operating in crisis mode?
That's a good question, Tom. I think there's been some summits here in Long Beach, in fact, with our GoBiz team and some of the leaders from Washington coming together and rallying around. I think you're talking about building a freight, maybe a freight cabinet level in Washington.
There's certainly been talk about that.
Yeah, there's been a lot of that, and then how does that pipeline down into state government? But I think we have a ways to go in terms of really working together and accelerating our voice in those forums, both at the state level and the national level.
And I know you've had leadership positions in some organizations that might serve that purpose. Mm-hmm. And after a short break, we'll start by talking about your work with CAPA, as well as the American Association of Port Authorities, and maybe look forward to the future and get your predictions about what might be coming down the pike.
Sure.
This is Tom O'Brien. This is Trade Talks, and we'll be back with Kristin Decas from the Port of Hueneme after this short break.
Great having you.
Incredible women.
I wish they had those kind of cool careers for women when we were growing up.
So in this flashback, we're all the same age?
Yeah.
What does everyone want to be when they grow up?
If I say 2 jobs, do I get extra credit?
No.
I want to make immersive video games. I want to revolutionize 3D printing. I want to analyze data from the cloud.
I want to be a meteor.
You mean meteorologist?
No.
That's great, Al. Follow your dreams.
For the record, I was a baby in the 70s.
Hello and welcome back to Trade Talks. I'm Tom O'Brien, and my guest today is Kristin Decas, the Port Director and CEO at the Port of Hueneme. Kristin, welcome back.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Just before the break, we were talking about some of the supply chain challenges and opportunities that came about as a result of the pandemic. And I'm interested in your perspective in leadership roles at the California Association of Port Authorities and the American Association of Port Authorities, because that gives you some unique insight into how the rest of the nation and the rest of the world is responding as well from a port perspective.
Sure. So these associations can be very powerful in how they influence policy decisions. This is particularly timely right now as we're facing these supply chain disruptions, and trying to build up infrastructure and capacity is a really important conversation that we're having at both the federal and the state level. And these associations lend us an avenue to really come together and be a more powerful and united voice around those issues.
And you've had a chance to sort of look at the way ports operate around the globe. Is there a best practice that you point to, or do you look at somebody and say, that's a leader, that's what we aspire to be?
So that's a really great question, and that's another role of these associations, is where we all can come together. And the industry really is quite small, even though it's so grand. But we really use these associations as a place to interact with one another and network and really learn what those best practices are, whether it's around cybersecurity, port security, environmental practices, operational efficiencies. All sorts of conversations happen inside those groups that really make us a better industry.
And so all of what you've just enumerated is what makes a port competitive, I guess. Is that what you're saying?
For sure. So the better we can serve our customers, the more efficient that we can be, and in all honesty, the best that we can build up our workforce and serve our communities by bringing back economic and social good through the types of jobs and the sustainable practices of ports is better for our local communities, our national footprint, and even the global footprint.
You just referenced both environmental measures as well as cybersecurity. And my guess is, had we had this discussion maybe 10, 20 years ago, they would not be in the mix when we're talking about what really makes a port operation successful. Is that fair to say?
I think that's quite true. My background actually is in environmental policy and law, and I don't know if that's a degree that would land you a port director job 20 years ago, but it's becoming increasingly important being leaders in the environmental space to ensure that we have operations that protect public health and air quality and those sorts of things.
When you look at the work that you want to do, projecting toward the future and future success, is it in increments of 5 and 10 years? Are you looking at 20 years down the road or even further beyond? What's most critical to you?
So at the Port of Hueneme, we're in the process of updating our strategic plan. It was sunset in 2020. It was a 5-year plan at that time, and we figured that horizon actually wasn't a long enough stretch, so we wanted to make it a 2030 plan. And then COVID hit, so we sort of given up and giving it a year number and just coming up more with a 10-year planning horizon. And so we're looking at building up certain pillars through our strategic planning process, primarily around infrastructure, which is so important to increasing our capacity, around economic vitality, which is that to create jobs and create economic prosperity, around environment, around innovation, and then social equity and inclusion.
So those are the 5 pillars for your strategic planning. I'd like to talk about some of those a little bit and see what you're preparing for. Technology is critical. Information exchanges, the ability to move cargo more efficiently. What's at the top of your list or at Hueneme's list for the next 10 years?
So one of the big space in the tech world and conversations all the ports are having is bringing visibility into the supply chain and data optimization. That's a very big conversation that's happening globally around the supply chain. For us in particular, we're very interested in that and how we amp up in that arena. But we're also at the local level doing something that I think is quite cool. It's a collaborative. It's called FathomWorks, where we've partnered up with our Navy, with our Economic Development Collaborative, with a company called Matter Labs, which is a venture capitalist company, and very brilliant young men that run that and have access to the tech community, and the port. And we've designated some warehouse space behind, on our complex. It's an opportunity zone, which gets some of the tax benefits around the opportunity zone and deferred investments in tech and innovation. And we have about $8 million of equipment in there that the Navy's provided. And so we're actually able to print a car engine in this space. We have simulators back there, all kinds of really cool stuff. In fact, now it's so fun to say that we're printing equipment to support our shoreside power system, repair parts that are very difficult to get because they're made in Europe and whatnot. And we can actually manufacture these parts right at our port complex through this incubator hub. So the idea and the goal of this is to create bridges for tech for our community to come in and develop and sell it to the port or Navy, or vice versa, take developments happening inside the Navy, bridge through our incubator lab, and then commercialize it for the U.S. consumer. So it's really quite cool. And then we've taken it to a whole nother level in that we're also inviting the youth to come in and play in this space. We have a drone cage, we have a tank where you can test underwater robotic equipment, and I'm pleased to say that we just had the region's high school robotics event at the Port of Hueneme, where we had 1,200 kids come and compete in this playground, if you will, of technology. And it was like NASCAR, right? So they had these robots that came up and they competed, of all things, in technology and transportation. So these robots were designed to offload cargo. So they're competing to offload the cargo of the robot, and then they race back to the pit to repair the robot so it can go on to the next competition. So really exciting things that are happening in this innovation space at the port.
As an educator, that warms my heart. But it's fascinating because what you've mentioned is both seems like a short-term and a long-term approach to incorporating technology. And it also involves all of those partnerships that we've already talked about today. It's public and private, different levels of government, perhaps. Fascinating.
And the opportunity to transfer technology that's developed in this space so it can serve other agriculture, for instance, or other sectors in our economy can gain from the technology that gets developed. So
that's fascinating.
Pretty cool.
Congratulations. One of the hot button issues is with regard to technology is automation, what opportunities it offers, but also what it means for the future workforce, including a shift from labor to technology-based operations at a port. Is this something that you're thinking about at Hueneme? Is it part of the plans that you're making?
So that's a very pressing conversation that's happening at the larger ports where you're seeing ship-to-shore automation, and the challenge is how do you green and automate technology so it's zero emission without compromising labor. At the Port of Hueneme, that's not something on the short term or even long term that I think is going to be a big question mark for us because we're just such a hands-on port. Right now, although it could change, you're talking about automated vehicles and whatnot, but you need labor to drive cars off ship. You simply do. We're running on mobile cranes. We don't really see a future of ship-to-shore automated technology at the cost for the scale of Hueneme. Our competitiveness is really grounded in our fact that we can get products from destination to origin quickly, and the pinpoint for that is not the mobile harbor crane. It's the whole system that gives us the flexibility and the speed to market. So to make massive investments in automation really wouldn't make sense for a modest increase in productivity just in that offloading piece of the supply chain.
Right. There's also, I think, other work underway. The iHub project that's happening at Hueneme. Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
So yes, the office of I think it's small business advocates under the governor's under the governor's office has designated the port of one of the state's 10 iHub designations this year. I think they might do close to 10 a year, and so this year we were one of the selected iHubs, and that is wonderful because it gives us a $250,000 grant, and it really focuses in on that social equity and inclusion piece, so that we can support minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, and uplift them and bring them into the space of tech through our FathomWorks laboratory. So we're just thrilled. We just got news of this over the last couple weeks, and it really will leverage our FathomWorks laboratory.
And you're creating and building talent pipelines for the future workforce, which makes me wonder, what are you going to be looking for in terms of port staff when you're hiring in the next 10 years?
Well, I'll hit that in a couple of ways. One of the things that we do at Port of Hueneme is we have a global trade and logistics class, and it's a class that runs every semester for 12 weeks, and we have experts from the field come into the port classroom, if you will, and educate students on maritime career opportunities, and then we take them out to the field so they can see all the different types of jobs affiliated with the port, and then the excelling student gets a paid internship with the port, and we've had students come out of that program and find themselves here at CSU Long Beach, and it's just one of the most rewarding things to really influence a life and see someone build a career that's so promising through this global trade and logistics class. The other note I'll make is that I had the pleasure of working with Tyler Reeb, and he published a book on the new mobility and empowering the workforce, and I was privileged to help participate in developing a chapter in that. And as part of that exercise, I wanted to really get a pulse of what our industry is thinking, or what are really characteristics that are important for the next generation of the workforce. And what I learned from every port director that answered the survey is the importance of those soft skills, of those leadership skills, of those interpersonal skills. You can train anyone in something and you can get a strong background, but you really need leadership and character. And so I would say that that still remains a very important part of the complexion of the next generation of our workforce.
Right, and I think you raise an important point that the skills that can be developed in programs like the one you just mentioned prepare students for success wherever they land, whether it's in the port sector or not. So kudos to you for that. Apart from the technology and some of those, some of the workforce trends we talked about, there are other broader societal trends underway. I think we mentioned the new or enhanced awareness of the environment. How do you see that impacting the work that you do 10 years down the road? Is it an acceleration of what's already underway?
Well, what I think would be cool is really, again, going back to that blue skies thinking and really be able to move in that direction of the zero emission port complex, and then lifting up the people that live in our communities to be able to tap those jobs in that space and be part of growing that technology. And the question, Bill, is how do we develop those pipelines for our communities who are often lost? In Hueneme, 29% of our students in Oxnard don't graduate from high school. How do we change that? And how do we build that pipeline for those people to really be the benefactors of the jobs that are created through the goods movement system?
And California really has taken a leadership role in that area. So is it fair to say that, can I assume that you're bullish on California's future as a leader in trade?
I think we have a lot going for us in California. You may hear of the mass exodus and those sorts of things, but we have the geography, we have the resources, and we have the talent in the state, and I'm highly optimistic that we're going to get this done.
So in terms of how you're going to define competitiveness in the future, we've talked about defining it in the present. Anything new you would add to the mix?
You know, one thing that I guess I would say, one of the most compelling things, and not to toot your horn, but I really believe we have such a strong academic system, both through the UC schools and the CSU schools in the state, and they're highly competitive. As a parent that has a daughter in the Cal Poly space or system in university, it's very competitive access to really great education, and I think that's going to be a really important strength for us in this California economy.
And if your partners outside of the state ask you what makes California unique apart from the education sector, what would you tell them?
I think we really are leaders in the environment. We are the only ports in the world really that require that ships get plugged in. They are doing it in other places, but we really lead the way in terms of reducing emissions, focusing on inequality. It just comes down to having the balance and how we do that in a way that you don't break the back of the goods movement system.
And so as we sort of near the end of our discussion, we've learned a lot about Hueneme. Thanks for that. Is there something that we haven't covered, that as part of the story for Hueneme, that you would like to have everyone know about?
Sure, I think I'd like to highlight our contributions to the community. Traditionally, we would have a banana festival. When I started about 10 years ago, was our 75th anniversary at the port, and we decided to celebrate this with a banana fest to bring in the community and showcase the value propositions of a working port and what we really do inside the gates. And so day one, I'm driving to the first event with my daughters, who at the time were 7 and 9, and there's all this traffic. I couldn't believe it. We expected it would be great if 1,000 people showed up. Well, 8,000 people came to the port that day, and we ran out of bananas at 3 o'clock, but it's gone on now as an annual tradition to have this festival, and upwards of 12,000 people on an annual basis come out to the port. So that's been really fun and important and influencing in our community. But with the COVID pandemic, we weren't able to obviously have this event. And so we really kind of switched gears and thought, how can we continue to support our community? It's particularly during these really tough times when we're shutting down our economy, and the port's doing well. So we took our resources and we started something called Feeding the Front Lines, where our customers set up, and Del Monte contributed 1.1 million pounds of produce, as you said at the beginning. And we also found other partners in Food Share that brought all this food, and we did these food drives. And every time we did one, close to 500 to 1,000 people would either walk or drive up to get some goods. So it's been rewarding in the sense that we were able to make somewhat of a touch to our community during this really tough time and provide enough food to last a family 2 weeks through each food drive. So that's the DNA of the Port of Hueneme. We really want to give to our environment, and we want to give to our community, because why else move goods if you can't make a difference in the world?
Yeah. That's a great place to stop. You've really emphasized the fact that when you've seen one port, you've seen one port, and Hueneme is really unique. And I'm really pleased that we can share your story and the story of the port with our audience. Thank you for being part of Trade Talks, and I hope you will join us the next time we gather around the negotiating table. I'm Tom O'Brien. This is Trade Talks. Thank you. Thank you for joining us for this very special episode of Trade Talks. My thanks to our guest, Kristin Decas, Director and CEO of the Port of Hueneme, and thanks to the Harbor Association of Industry and Commerce and SoCalGas for the generous support of this year's Trade Talk series. You'll find more information about HAIC's work and the ways you can become engaged at the bottom of the screen.